jointly at the Sofitel, Abidjan, Ivory Coast. Cote d'Ivoire was selected by the Board of Governors as a host of the 2025 annual meetings following its expression of interest to do so, and after a determination by the bank that the country has the capacity to host the meetings. And of course, Cote d'Ivoire is the headquarter country of the African Development Bank Group. Let me take you through what the objectives of the annual meetings are. The annual meetings are primarily a statutory event of the bank group. And during these meetings, the Board of Governors, as the highest decision-making and oversight organs of the bank and the fund, will review the annual report on the finances, operations, and activities of the bank and fund during the preceding financial year. The governors will then deliberate, consider, and then adopt resolutions on key decisions and conclusions of the annual meetings. There will be a governors' dialogue which will provide a platform for governors to discuss with the president of the bank and senior management issues of strategic significance to the continent in the context of the bank group's 10-year strategy, 2024 to 2033. A peculiar aspect of this year's dialogue is the expected participation of selected youth from different regions of the continent to reflect on how best to leverage the continent's burgeoning youth demographic dividend. Also worth mentioning is a critical element of the annual meeting, which is the election of the next president of the bank, which will be held on the 29th of May during the annual meetings. You will hear a lot about the theme of the annual meeting. The theme for this year is making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. And this theme and associated knowledge events will be elaborated by the Chief Economist and Vice President, who is here with me in this press conference. Let me take you through what the program of the annual meetings will look like. The annual meetings, as I said to you, is a formal statutory meeting of the bank. And the statutory aspects are detailed in the program of the annual meetings, which are available on the website. And let me also note that the annual meetings, particularly statutory meetings, will be closed to the public. In other words, will only be member countries who are delegates to the meeting that will be invited. On day one, 3 of the subsidiary organs of the boards of governors, namely the Bureau, the Joint Steering Committee, and the Steering Committee on the election of the President, will meet to discuss various items on their agenda. The formal opening ceremony will be held on the second day from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Also, on day 2, we'll have the first sitting of the Board of Governors, which will be held from about 14:45 to 17:00 hours. During this session, the Boards of Governors will review and, as appropriate, approve recommendations from the various subsidiary organs and adopt relevant resolutions. Further, on day 2, the second sitting of the Board of Governors will be held from 17:15 to about 18:15 to elect executive directors of the bank and select executive directors of the fund. The Governors' Dialogue, which will form the third sitting of the Board of Governors, will be held on day 3 from about 8:30 to 1300. Also on day 3, among the events scheduled is the Board of Governors conversation with the candidates that are seeking to be president of the bank. Here, the Board of Governors will have conversation with each of the candidates for the office of the president from about 1400 to about 1930. On day 4, during the 4th sitting of the Board of Governors, the governors will elect a new president of the bank. And this is scheduled from 9 a.m., and nobody knows how long this will last. On day 5, which is the 5th sitting of the Board of Governors, which will be held from about 11 a.m. to 12:30, the official communique and the official records of the annual meetings will be adopted. And that will follow The closing ceremony will follow from about 12:45 to 13:15, where there will be a ceremonial handover from the chairperson of the Board of Governors to her successor. I will now call on the Chief Economist and Vice President, Economic Governance and Knowledge Management to address you on the theme of the annual meetings and knowledge events. And that will be followed by the Director of Communications and External Relations, who will address you on the press events plan, as well as take your questions for us to answer. Following the addresses, we will answer your questions, as many of them as you may have, within the time allocated, because we must finish within an hour. Let me use this opportunity to thank you, members of the press, those present here physically, and those online listening to us, for your kind attention, and we will welcome your questions at the appropriate time. Thank you very much.
Maintenant, nous allons écouter le vice-président du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement, chargé de la gouvernance économique et de la gestion des connaissances. Monsieur Ourama.
Thank you very much. And to the members of the press and those in the room and those who are watching, joining us virtually, you are very much welcome to this press conference. As already mentioned by the Secretary General of the bank, the theme of the annual meetings for this year is making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. Within this theme already, we can see what the focus is, which is about how we can harness better what Africa has already in order to be able to drive development in Africa. That means looking for how to better harness Africa's fiscal resources, fiscal capital, how to harness human capital of the continent for Africa's development, how to harness the business capital for Africa's development, how to harness Africa's natural capital. And you would agree with me that Africa is very rich in all these forms of capital and more. The question is, how do we as Africans make the best use of these resources to channel them to the development of the continent? And in addressing how we best mobilize this capital, we also address how we best use what is mobilized to address the development challenges of the continent. And within those two themes, is the embedded issue around how do we plug the leakages of resources that is mobilized in Africa in order to ensure that they are channeled to Africa's development. So it will be quite an interesting set of dialogues that will be held with our heads of states, our ministers, leading its economic experts around the world, but also civil society and member institutions and our member governments during this year's annual meetings. So in that regard, we are going to be having a set of 4 major knowledge events. One of them, which will be on the 27th of May, from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Abidjan time, is a presidential dialogue. And this presidential dialogue will bring our heads of states to have a focused dialogue on what needs to be done to make Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. Following that, on the 28th of May, will be a high-level plenary knowledge event, which is for the launch of the 2025 African Economic Outlook Report. We call AEO report for short. And that AEO report every year focuses on the theme of the annual meetings of the bank group, which is on making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. So having heard from our heads of states, we now go to technical experts to look at how the views and researched evidence on how Africa is performing in terms of mobilizing its own capital, utilizing its own capital, but also curbing the outflow of its own capital in order to make them work better for development. Then on the 29th of May, from 10 a.m. to 12 noon, Abidjan time, we will have a second thematic knowledge event on leveraging Africa's capital for development amidst increased economic challenges. We know we are living in a dynamic world where the policies, domestic policies that are made by other countries and other continents affect everyone else. And how would Africa be able to leverage its own capital within this changing global economic landscape in order to ensure that this capital works best and better for Africa's development? So that would be the second thematic knowledge event. Then on the 30th of May, from 9 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. Abidjan time, we will have the third and final knowledge event on building effective institutions for Africa for harnessing capital for Africa's development. So this one now is bringing together in terms of what we need to do as a continent, in terms of the types of institutions we need to build, they strengthen what we have, what we don't have, and what needs to be done to ensure that our domestic institutions are fit for purpose in order to make our capital, Africa's capital, work for Africa's development. Without going too much into the depth of the theme, so that we'll have the time to hear and answer your questions, I would like to stop here and just call on you to join us on those days that are mentioned here in Abidjan for what will be a very interesting and impactful knowledge events and policy dialogues on these themes mentioned. Thank you, SG.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président. Chers consoeurs, chers confrères, alors pour ces assemblées annuelles 2025 du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement, comme le secrétaire général, Monsieur le secrétaire général et Monsieur le Vice-président vous ont donné les éléments constitutifs du programme. Et pour ce qui concerne les médias, nous aurons le lundi 26 la conférence de presse du président du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement, Dr Akinwumi Adesina, et le matin, donc à 8 heures. Ensuite, comme le secrétaire général vous a indiqué, la conférence de presse de clôture qui a lieu le vendredi 30 mai, à partir juste après la cérémonie de clôture qui aura lieu à 12h45. Et avant cela, il y a naturellement toutes les activités qui sont ouvertes à la presse, c'est-à-dire la cérémonie d'ouverture qui est prévue le mardi. Et cette cérémonie d'ouverture donc qui sera suivie du dialogue présidentiel. Et après le dialogue présidentiel, il y aura donc, tel que l'a décliné le vice-président du groupe de la banque chargé des connaissances, il y aura les différentes activités de connaissances pour lesquelles toutes ces activités sont ouvertes aux médias. Alors, les activités du Conseil des gouverneurs, comme vous l'a indiqué le secrétaire général, ne sont pas ouvertes aux médias. La seule activité du Conseil des gouverneurs à laquelle les médias vont assister, j'allais dire, c'est l'annonce du futur président du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement qui sera certainement faite, soit je parle sous le contrôle du secrétaire général, je parle du secrétaire général ou je ne sais pas, le président du Conseil des gouverneurs. Et à l'issue en dehors de cette activité et du communiqué final donc, qui va être par la suite lu, il n'y a pas, pour ce qui concerne les gouverneurs, de séances auxquelles les journalistes vont assister. Ce sont ces précisions que je voulais donner par rapport à ce qui concerne la participation des médias. Et pour ceux qui voudront participer aux assemblées annuelles du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement pour 2025, vous voudriez bien vous inscrire sur le site dédié aux assemblées annuelles. Il y a un code qui va vous être attribué pour finaliser votre inscription. Pour ceux qui ne sont pas basés à Abidjan, il serait important, sur le site, il est prévu, il y a une ligne pour les hébergements et aussi pour les billets, pour les avions. Vous voudrez bien vous prendre les hôtels dès maintenant pour éviter, n'est-ce pas, parce qu'en cette période-là, il y a beaucoup de personnes qui arrivent dans Abidjan, il y a beaucoup d'activités en cette période. Donc, veuillez prendre vos hôtels au plus tôt, ainsi que vos billets d'avion. Voici ce que je pouvais dire en ce qui concerne les médias pour cette Assemblée annuelle du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement. Et, Monsieur le secrétaire général, Monsieur le vice-président, nous allons maintenant entrer dans les discussions avec les médias. Je voudrais signaler à ce stade que nous avons, en plus des journalistes qui sont devant vous, Monsieur le vice-président, Monsieur le secrétaire général, des journalistes qui sont en ligne. Et pour les journalistes qui sont en ligne, vous voudriez bien écrire devant vous vos noms clairement pour qu'on puisse vous identifier. Et vous pouvez, n'est-ce pas, appuyer sur le bouton pour lever la main pour dire que vous demandez la parole. Aussi, vous pouvez écrire vos questions que nous allons transmettre, n'est-ce pas, au secrétaire général et au vice-président pour avoir les meilleures réponses possibles. Pour ceux qui sont dans la salle, vous donnez votre nom, votre média et vous posez votre question. Alors, pour cette séance, nous souhaitons que la conférence de presse ne dure qu'1 heure au lieu de ce que nous avions prévu parce qu'il y a des contraintes d'agenda. Donc, nous souhaitons que vos questions soient précises, concises et qu'il n'y ait pas trop de digressions pour que nous puissions tenir dans le temps et que vous puissiez aussi avoir les meilleures réponses possibles. Messieurs les journalistes, chers collègues, je voudrais maintenant vous laisser la parole avec la permission du secrétaire général et du vice-président. Présentez-vous, donnez votre nom, votre organe de presse et posez votre question. Juste devant vous pour ouvrir le micro et poser votre question. Une fois que vous avez fini de poser la question, vous éteignez votre micro pour permettre au secrétaire général de vous répondre ou au vice-président de vous répondre. Merci beaucoup.
OK, merci beaucoup. Je suis Jean-Charles Sibaï, journaliste à Business 24 Africa. J'ai une question pour le secrétaire général, une question pour Monsieur Orama et une question pour la communication. Pour Monsieur Orama, dans les éléments de savoir, on voit que vous allez mettre l'accent sur les ressources humaines en Afrique, ce qui est une bonne chose. Mais l'actualité actuellement dans le monde, et l'Afrique n'est pas épargnée, c'est la guerre commerciale, la guerre économique à laquelle nous assistons. Et sur ce chapitre, nous souhaiterions que la BAD prenne le leadership. Où on va? Qu'est-ce qui va se passer? Comment l'Afrique se prépare? C'est vrai qu'il y a un élément de savoir sur comment profiter des ressources naturelles, mais il n'y a pas que. Il y a toute la stratégie diplomatique, il y a toute la stratégie de négociation. Je veux dire, ce qui se passe actuellement va tellement impacter l'Afrique qu'il serait bon que, certainement dans les éléments de savoir, que vous insistiez là-dessus, puisque pour une fois, les chefs d'État, les chefs de gouvernement, les ministres de l'économie et des finances, ces grands décideurs du développement seront là. Donc, on aura besoin du leadership de la BAD sur le sujet. La question est-ce que l'élément de savoir que vous avez prévu est suffisamment étoffé pour nous éclairer sur qu'est-ce qu'on fait, nous, en tant qu'Africains? L'autre question, c'est pour le secrétaire général. Évidemment, l'une des choses les plus importantes, c'est l'élection du nouveau président. L'élection du nouveau président, pour nous donner un peu les conditions, pour qu'on sache comment on le choisit, comment il est candidat et combien de candidats il y a, quels sont ceux qui se sont prononcés pour le moment, ou bien c'est caché, tout le monde découvre le jour J comme ça, si on peut avoir de plus amples informations sur les candidatures et sur comment on le choisit. C'est du lobbying, c'est à main levée, voilà, on voudrait avoir une idée. C'est vrai qu'on ne va pas participer Et vous avez dit que les candidats vont venir se prononcer devant les gouverneurs. Mais évidemment, les gouverneurs, je ne pense pas que ce soit là qu'ils décident. Certainement, ils ont décidé avant. Donc, vraiment, vous pouvez nous éclairer là-dessus. Ensuite, toujours pour le secrétaire général, il y aura 6 000 personnes en Côte d'Ivoire. Ça fait 6 000 lits à trouver. J'espère qu'on vous a rassuré qu'on a suffisamment de lits dans le pays pour accueillir tout ce monde. Et puis enfin, pour la communication, il y aura une conférence de presse de clôture. Est-ce que cette conférence de presse de clôture va se faire avec le nouveau président élu ou bien l'ancien? Merci.
OK. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions dans la salle? Non. D'accord. On va aller, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, we'll go with the first question.
No, the first question was addressed to the
Vice.
chief economist, so he can start with the first.
Okay.
Yes. So thank you very much, colleague from Business 24 Africa. Very, very pertinent question. So generally, like I've mentioned, what happens is that every year we select a team based on the bank's analysis of the global and regional economic dynamics and what implications, what we consider of most implication for the continent that year. And the point you raise about trade wars is very much aligned with the theme of the annual meeting in terms of making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. And that is why in listing the forms of capital that we are looking at in the report, which will be launched at the annual meetings, the African Economic Outlook reports, it includes not only the fiscal resources, but also human capital, business capital, natural capital, and other forms of capital. So the question you asked with regards to the issues about the economics of trade, which is basically where the issues around tariffs and other points that you are raising comes in, will be very well dealt with under the theme of the business capital. And as a precursor, the impacts of trade tariffs on economies, both in the short, medium, and long term, are well known. But also, it depends on how countries respond to those domestic policies of their peers with whom they trade. So without preempting the full report, I would just encourage you to read the report when it comes out and join us at the launch of the African Economic Outlook report, because all these things will be well dealt with within that theme. So actually, I'm very grateful to the African Development Bank leadership for selecting this theme at this time, because the global economic dynamics appear to just confirm that we're able to predict ahead of time what is coming, and therefore do in-depth research and analysis and consultations with member states and development partners to be able to come up with apt, implementable policy recommendations for how Africa should respond to such dynamic changes in the global economy. I hope that answers your question. Good, thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Chibai. Well, while you're worried about tariffs, we are saying let Africa work for Africa. Africa's capital should work for Africa. So as journalists, please tell our leaders that they have to look inward and use our capital to work for Africa, because that's where the world is turning to. You take care of yourself. So I hope as journalists you will stimulate those among our leaders and political people wherever they are. How is the president elected? The president is elected by the governors of the bank group. The 81 governors elect the president of the bank. And the question is, who are the candidates? You already know who the candidates are. They are published, and I know you as an investigative journalist, you've gone to the website where the candidates are published. 5 candidates from 5 regional member countries, from Senegal, from Chad, from Mauritania, from Zambia, and from South Africa. So you already have that. They're available on the website. The conversation with the candidates is the start of the engagement, and then followed the next day by the actual election. Under the rules of the election, the candidate will have what we call double majority to be able to be elected as president, which is 50 plus 1% of the vote of all the bank shareholders, the 81, and 50 plus 1% of all regional member countries. If you have that double majority, then you are elected. You'll be declared elected the president of the bank. That I said whether we expect about upward of 6,000 people, whether there are 6,000 beds in Cote d'Ivoire. I'm sure there are 6,000 beds in Cote d'Ivoire. Yours is one of the beds. But I know you are asking the question, do we have enough hotels to cater for about 6,000 people? One thing you need to know that some of those people will not sleep, so they don't need a bed. They will work for 24 hours. Because there's a whole lot of activities going on, a lot of celebrations, so they don't need a bed. But for those who will need a bed, we are confident that over 40 hotels in this Abidjan should be able to cater for the participants. And remember also that among the 6,000 are Cote d'Ivoire citizens who already have beds, and they don't need second beds when they attend their annual meetings. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you very much.
Oui. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Secrétaire général. La dernière question sur la conférence de presse de clôture, je pense que vous pouvez aussi répondre à cette question. The closing press conference, who will give it?
Oh, thank you. The closing press conference, remember that the new president is only sworn in on the 1st of September. So until the 1st of September, the new president will not be doing any press conference as president of the bank. So he will be president-elect and not yet president of the bank, he or she, whatever the case may be. So the president on the ground will finish with the closing press conference, and then we will turn a new chapter after the new president takes office. And then, of course, the status quo will begin in terms of the role of the new president subsequent to close the press conference during the subsequent annual meetings thereafter. I hope that is clear. But of course, the new president will be introduced for sure, but not yet during closing press conference, or else he or she will be committing a coup.
Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire général. Et il y a, pour les journalistes qui sont en ligne, vous pouvez poser vos questions soit en les écrivant dans le chat, soit en les posant directement au secrétaire général et au vice-président. En attendant, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, on a une question en ligne venant d'un journaliste du Zimbabwe qui s'appelle Sidney Kawaza. Sidney Kawaza, question is, the African Development Bank has been leading dialogue on Zimbabwe's debt clearing efforts, and he has been derailed on several occasions with the United States, which maintain the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act. With the Trump administration stringing on a wrap-up, how confident are you as facilitators of a debt clearance program that the U.S. will return to the negotiation table? Secondly, what is the way forward in trying to bring back the U.S. to the dialogue table in Zimbabwe efforts to clear its debt?
Thank you. You are just telling me that US is no longer on the dialogue table because I'm not aware. Because I don't know that they left the dialogue table. Because under that premise, I'm not aware that they've left. I don't know that they have left. So I just believe that the dialogue will continue. One administration carries on with the other, unless there's something you know that I don't know, because we believe that our president, being the focal point, the champion on this, will continue to do the job. We've not received any communication to the contrary, unless you are telling me something that I don't know. So I cannot say that the US will not return to the table because I don't know that they have already left. So that's my answer to the question.
Question. My name is Navu Sandu from New Delhi. From New Delhi papers in Zimbabwe. Prof. Urama spoke of a knowledge even on how to build strong institutions. Is it a question of Africa not having strong institutions, or the lack of political will do make the existing institution work properly?
Thank you very much for that question. I think the answer is both. There are certain stock of every form of capital that we are looking at that is required for countries to be able to structurally transform. So Africa has financing gaps, which you are going to see in the report. There are gaps in human capital development, which you are going to see, and also including the brain drain that happens on the continent. But also for institutions, there are different gaps that Africa still needs to build over time. But that doesn't mean that you have equal needs for those building institutions in all African countries, because African countries are diverse and at different stages of development, and so are the maturity of the different institutions as well. So there is need to strengthen existing institutions, but there's also need to mobilize the political will to build the relevant institutions and allow the institutions to perform their functions effectively. So it's not either or. For you to build institutions, it takes time, it takes investments, but it also takes the extant laws and regulations that allows those institutions to perform their duties effectively. And in doing the second, you need that political will that you are talking about. I hope that addresses your question. Good.
Let me just add to the question, the answer that the chief economist has provided. You as journalists also are part and parcel of making our institutions work. You know, there's a tendency to think that it is all about the leaders. Remember that the whole essence of your work is also about accountability. So if you notice the institutions that are not working, why don't you say so? If you notice the lack of political will and making the institutions to work, not work the way they should work, why don't you say so? Because it is only that way that you can strengthen the working of those institutions by making public through clear, unbiased journalistic activities that you can highlight this, because you can help in exposing inefficient institutions that will stimulate them to be efficient, also stimulate the political will to make those institutions. So it is a responsibility of everyone. Don't just look at the leaders. You have a role to play as well.
Oui, allez-y.
Bonjour, je suis Moutiou Adjibinourou de l'agence Ecofin. Alors, les assemblées annuelles de la BAD auront lieu en mai. mais bien avant, dès la semaine prochaine, je crois, il y a les institutions de Bretton Woods, le FMI, la Banque mondiale qui vont tenir leurs assemblées, et l'OMC également. Quand on sait que la BAD est aujourd'hui l'institution faîtière qui permet aux pays africains de mobiliser du financement international pour des projets structurants, et dans un contexte où le multilatéralisme est menacé de par le monde, on le voit aujourd'hui. Comment est-ce que la BAD compte capitaliser sur ces prochaines conférences-là qui auront lieu avec ces institutions de Bretton Woods-là pour aborder des questions essentielles pour le continent afin de mieux structurer l'agenda qui sera déroulé lors des assemblées de la BAD ici en Côte d'Ivoire. Donc, comment est-ce que les équipes de la BAD se préparent pour vraiment utiliser la tribune que leur offriront le FMI, la Banque mondiale, l'OMC dans les prochaines semaines pour pouvoir aborder des questions qui sont essentielles pour les assemblées de la BAD. Merci.
J'ai une autre question? OK, d'accord. Oui, allez-y.
Tant qu'il y a une institution multilatérale, pensez-vous que les instruments régionaux ou sous-régionaux jouent vraiment un rôle important dans le développement des pays africains? Ou bien vous, en tant que banque panafricaine, qu'est-ce que vous attendez concrètement de ces institutions sous-régionaux-là, au niveau du financement des pays dans le développement? Merci.
OK.
We will share I'm sure we'll make contributions on the two questions. I don't know that I got the last question properly. Regional institutions, which regional institutions are you talking about? I mean, you need to be able to drill down.
En fait, c'est vrai que la banque appuie les pays pour pouvoir développer leur économie et autres, mais il y a aussi des instruments sous-régionaux. Il parlait, par exemple, il prend l'exemple, par exemple, de la zone BCA, de l'UEMOA, avec, par exemple, un instrument comme l'UEMOA Titre qui apporte, qui fait chaque fois d'élever les fonds dans chaque semaine au niveau des pays. Et c'est un exemple qu'il prend. Est-ce que vous pensez que ces instruments-là jouent vraiment un rôle capital? Qu'est-ce que vous voulez qu'on puisse améliorer pour apporter encore plus d'appui au niveau de ces pays-là? Merci.
Thank you. Let's be clear about what the spring meetings are all about. The World Bank IMF meeting is just like the African Development Bank meetings where their governors and shareholders meet. So, yes, we are partners in many things. We work together, particularly with the World Bank. We engage in policy dialogue with the IMF and the World Bank. We co-finance projects with the World Bank. But at the same time, it is not about us leveraging the meetings of the World Bank. We work together. Yes, the bank will go to the meeting just like they will come to ours. We may have side events on the sidelines of their meetings. Our governors may have meetings to talk about issues that are germane to Africa. But it's not about leveraging the World Bank meetings to get support for Africa, because our governors or our countries are members already, and they will use the platform of their membership to advance agenda that will be useful to the continent as part of their statutory obligations within the bank. The IDA, the International Development Association of the World Bank, of which many African countries benefit from, is a platform for that for those discussions to happen. So we do not expect it to be a platform as such for African Development Bank to intervene on African issues. But we go there as participants, as partners, but at the same time doing our own thing on issues that pertain to the continent. So let's get that very clear. When we come here for our annual meetings, they will also come. They may have side events. They may want to interact with us. We'll have bilaterals with our peers on different areas just to be able to cooperate more. So I thought that was important. Let me leave the sub-regional questions to the chief economist in terms of how they work together with the bank to be able to support regional member countries.
Yeah, thank you very much. International finance institutions and regional and national finance institutions all work together in several ways, co-financing projects, and also knowledge development, working together to look at regional and sub-regional issues, national issues, in order to advise governments appropriately. And we do all those with all the sub-regional institutions in Africa, and also other multilateral institutions in Africa that are at Pan-African level. So we all work together in a very proactive way, and many of them will be at the annual meetings when we come for these meetings. And basically, in both diagnosing the problems for Africa, finding resources for Africa, we all work together. And the role of African institutions in helping to make Africa's capital work for Africa's development is needed even much more now than ever before. And that is why the team that we have is germane, and they're also engaging in trying to see how can they become more efficient in mobilizing resources for Africa, in managing the resources mobilized to channel it to Africa's development, but also in helping African countries to be able to plug the leakages so that we can retain Africa's resources for Africa's development. So it's a collective effort. Okay?
OK. Merci, Monsieur le secrétaire général, Monsieur le vice-président. La conférence de presse est aussi diffusée dans nos réseaux sociaux. Et une question nous vient des réseaux sociaux. La question est la suivante. Kurabashi STEM is from Ethiopia. Today, I was in a discussion with your amazing team on the poultry value chain in Ethiopia, representing my CEO STEM, plus in Bahir, in Ethiopia. The question is, what is the bank's initiative to work with the local civil society while the political situation is volatile in the country? Another question comes from social media. Après la fermeture de l'USAID, la Banque africaine de développement peut-elle nous dire l'impact de cette décision sur l'économie du continent, notamment dans les pays les plus vulnérables? La question vient de Yaya Kanté de Afrique Press. The second question comes from compte tenu de la récente dégradation de la note de certains des principaux actionnaires notés AAA de la banque, la nécessité d'une augmentation du capital exigible est devenue essentielle. Est-ce effectif? Y a-t-il dans l'actionnariat de la banque davantage d'actionnaires africains? La question est de Malik Ndao du journal Les Échos du Sénégal. Je reprends cette question. La question de Malik Ndao, je la reprends. Compte tenu du fait que certains pays, certains actionnaires ont eu leur note dégradée, est-ce que la banque va augmenter son capital exigible? Est-ce qu'il y a dans l'actionnariat de la banque davantage de pays africains?
Let me start with the last question, if I understand fully what it means. I don't know how many have been downgraded that he's aware of recently, but just to say that the shareholders of the bank last year approved a general callable capital increase for the African Development Bank, which was aimed at addressing any unenvisaged downgrade of any AAA rated shareholder. So that has been already accounted for as of last year during the annual meetings in Nairobi. So that I needed to. Now, as to whether or not there will be many more African shareholders of the bank, unless Africa evolves to more than 54 countries, then we will have many more additional African shareholders, because all African countries are shareholders of the bank as it exists. We're yet to find new African countries to join, because there's no more. They are all members already. Now, the question on the poultry, and then it goes away from poultry to civil society and the conflict in Ethiopia. That's a very big stretch. I'm hoping that the poultry is working very well in Ethiopia, and that the bank support is benefiting your industry and your entity. Now, I'm not sure I'm competent enough to speak as to this conflict and civil society in Ethiopia, because I do not have a lot of information on that. And so forgive me if I don't express, if I don't fully answer your question on that. But the point remains that the issues around development, irrespective of what is happening, the African Development Bank is very interested that nobody gets left behind, that our engagement with our countries and shareholders continue, while the details of how to deal with issues of conflict are being worked out where they're supposed to be worked out through the political processes. So that's all I can say in this regard. And then, of course, VP, if you have any more comments to make.
Yeah, thank you very much, SG. I will only address the other question on the impact of the USAID on African economies and vulnerabilities and so on. If you listen well to the theme of the annual meetings this year, it is about making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. So we would like to think that Africa has the resources it needs in order to be able to drive its own development. One lesson that I've learned in development economics over 35 years now, working on it, is that development is a do-it-yourself affair. It's a business that only works effectively if the citizens, the leadership, the people of a country or a continent determine to develop themselves, and then use their own capital to leverage support from partners. Not the other way around, in terms of, okay, we are looking for what the partners will do for us before we develop. So if you invest in your own development, you will necessarily have partners who come, because it's like in a market. So my mentor taught me very earlier on in life that you cannot declare profit if you don't have a shop.
Just to add to that, you see, when I do this press conference, it's not just for you to get information. I also challenge you. You are journalists, right? You are the ones advancing views, trying to influence views on the continent. Remember, the fund is called USAID. It belongs to the US. It doesn't belong to Africa. It's not as though Africa has something and they took it away from Africa. If I decide to give you a scholarship to go to school, and I decide one day to withdraw the scholarship, are you going to cry? You're going to look for how to help yourself to go to school. So it is not Africa's fund, it's US fund. The US can decide what it wants to do with its development aid. After that decision is made, how do you respond? Do you go and keep crying, the US has removed the money, so we're no longer able to develop? Then that means you don't exist if that fund doesn't exist. And that's why the theme is making Africa's capital work for Africa's development. When somebody gives you food every day, you line up and then you collect food, you become a lazy person. And so maybe this is an opportunity to now rise up and say, okay, we're going to go through difficult times because the scholarship has been withdrawn. But how do we find our way to ensure that we continue to go to school? I think that is important. And you journalists should ask those critical questions and not bemoan the fact that because USAID has been withdrawn, how is Africa going to? Some of you will even be asking, are you sure you're going to survive? Why don't you say, it's time to move on. It's time to work hard. It's time to focus. It's time to use our resources much better as we deploy for the needs of our citizens. You should be asking those questions.
Just to add a little bit, thank you so much, SG, for that addition. I also want to stress the fact that narratives matter. And the best people to create positive narratives about Africa's development are the journalists sitting here. So let's be positive. From the report you are going to see, we actually see that Africa has a lot of resources that it can use in order to do the scholarships, to do everything that we need to do in order to develop our continent. So let's focus on how to make Africa's capital work for Africa's development and not bemoan the declining in aid, because, I mean, you talk about the US, it's not only the US. If you look at all the other, because they also have their own fiscal challenges that they have to address. So let's try and focus our narratives on what Africa can do in order to be able to fill the financing gaps created by domestic policies that are made elsewhere, whether it be on trade tariffs or on aid for aids for development and other things. And that's why I'm saying, if Africa develops its own shop, then you create partnerships. So let's focus our dialogue on how to make Africa's capital work for Africa's development. And a lot of credit to development partners that has been supporting Africa over time. That support still remains important, but then it shouldn't be the sine qua non, the precondition for Africa's development. Thank you.
Merci bien. Il ne nous reste plus beaucoup de temps. Nous allons prendre une dernière série de questions avant de clôturer la conférence de presse. Oui, allez-y.
Et ma question va vers le secrétaire général. Dans l'analyse ou le commentaire qu'il a fait sur le thème des assemblées annuelles, il a fait savoir comme ça que laissons les capitaux africains travailler pour l'Afrique. C'est une phrase pour moi qui résonne fort. Et la question, est-ce qu'il estime qu'on empêche les capitaux africains de travailler pour l'Afrique? Est-ce que quelque part, les capitaux africains sont libres véritablement de travailler pour l'Afrique? Et quelle solution la BAD propose, quelle alternative la BAD propose pour permettre vraiment à ces capitaux africains de travailler pour l'Afrique? Certes, les capitaux existent, elles veulent travailler, mais est-ce qu'elles arrivent véritablement à travailler pour l'Afrique? Ça, c'est vraiment une de mes préoccupations. Et la seconde préoccupation, c'est au titre de l'agenda de la BAD, est-ce qu'il aura quelque part, en dehors des conférences de presse, une session où le président, Dr Adesina, va faire quand même un grand bilan de tout ce qu'il a mené comme activité pendant près de 10 ans qu'il a dirigé. Les fameux high five, nourrir l'Afrique, électrifier l'Afrique. Une des questions, est-ce qu'en partant de la tête de la BAD, est-ce qu'il pense avoir contribué à nourrir l'Afrique? Est-ce qu'il pense avoir contribué à électrifier l'Afrique? Ce sont vraiment ce genre de questions que nous, hommes des médias, on voudrait bien lui poser pendant ces assemblées annuelles. Donc, il faudrait vraiment créer un cadre pour des échanges un peu plus approfondis avec le président. Merci.
Oui.
Oui, merci de me donner la parole, Michel Daré de Afrimac. Donc, je voudrais rebondir sur la question qu'a posée tout à l'heure un collègue à l'économiste en chef. dans un environnement international où de plus en plus des voix s'élèvent pour dénoncer les taux abusifs pratiqués, enfin les taux abusifs appliqués aux pays africains. Je voudrais savoir quels sont les mécanismes mis en place par la BAD, qui est encore l'une des rares institutions africaines qui dispose d'un triple A en matière de rating. Donc, quels sont les mécanismes mis en place pour permettre quand même aux pays africains d'amoindrir le coût des taux jugés de plus en plus élevés, notamment lors de leur levée de fonds sur les marchés internationaux. Merci.
Je suis journaliste à Émergence économique du groupe Fraternité Matin. Pendant longtemps, nos pays, et même jusqu'à aujourd'hui, nos pays sont endettés sur les marchés internationaux pour construire leur développement. Et aujourd'hui, la BAD, lors de ces assises-là, va exhorter les États à davantage mobiliser les capitaux pour booster leur développement. Est-ce que c'est un changement, est-ce que c'est un signal fort pour un changement de paradigme, pour que les États sachent que désormais, on n'a plus le choix, et surtout vous avez planté le décor, le contexte mondial le permettant. Est-ce que c'est un signal fort vraiment pour changer de paradigme, pour axer que les États, nos États africains puissent mieux axer leur politique sur la mobilisation des ressources internes afin de lutter aussi contre l'endettement excessif de nos économies? Merci.
OK, merci. Il y a 3 questions qui sont en ligne. Et je vais ajouter ces 3 questions pour qu'on puisse clôturer. La question vient de... OK. La question vient de Noliwe Taman from the Lesotho News Agency. The question is, in light of a recent 50% tariff increase by the United States of Lesotho export, what steps is the African Development Bank taking a help member countries like Lesotho diversify their export markets and reduce over-reliance on a single trade partners? The second question coming on Zoom is Malika Dao from Sénégal. L'augmentation du capital répond-elle davantage à renforcer la capacité de prêt de la Banque africaine de développement ou pour répondre aux exigences d'une agence de notation de crédit? Last question from Ashta Ababakar Assadla de la télévision nationale du Tchad. Ma question est la suivante. Pour réussir le développement du continent africain à travers la mobilisation des ressources, quelle stratégie doit adopter la Banque africaine de développement lors des assemblées annuelles pour pallier aux difficultés des régions les plus affectées? C'est la dernière question.
Let me address the question on whether there will be sessions for the president for you to evaluate or to show whether or not the high fives have been achieved. Remember that there will be a breakfast session with journalists, which starts quite early. So be ready to be there to be able to assess and ask him questions on that. And then, of course, there will also be the closing press conference. And there will be other occasions, I believe, where TV interviews will happen with the journalists. Now, first of all, let me ask Yeah, I wanted to cue up to you in a way that I think maybe elicit from what do you think that there's someone preventing Africa's capital from working for Africa? Because since you have decided to have the topic, making Africa's capital work for Africa, do you think there's someone that's preventing Africa from doing that?
So if you read the topic, we said making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. That adjective means that Africa's capital is already working for Africa's development, but we just want to improve the effectiveness with which Africa's capital works for Africa's development. Very excellent questions, which already tells me there's a lot of interest in the dialogues that we are going to have. So whether there is someone or something, we do know that there are factors that limit the effectiveness of capital working for development, not only in Africa, but everywhere else in the world. And that's what the African Economic Outlook report is set to dig deep into, find what are those drivers that will allow capital work better for development, and how Africa can use those levers in order to make Africa's capital work better for development. So I invite you to the launch of the AEO for further discussions on that, just because we don't have much time now. Now, on the issues around debt, is this a strong paradigm shift? We hope so. That countries normally borrow when they have fiscal deficits. So you borrow only when you don't have the resources you need in order to do the business of governance that needs to be done. But if you can find those resources at home, then it reduces the level at which you will have the need to borrow. So if the continent improves more in domestic revenue mobilization, both the tax and non-tax revenues, if the country improves more in investing its fiscal resources, our savings, our sovereign wealth funds, our pension funds in Africa, and that will also help boost productivity on the continent and reduce the need for us borrowing more from outside. If Africa is able to do governance better in order to improve transparency and accountability and plug illicit financial flows, which Africa loses almost $90 billion every year. That's far much more than we get from AIDS and FDI, foreign direct investments, and so on every year. If we plug that, those resources will remain for Africa to develop itself. If we address the issues around corruption, from which our estimates is that the continent loses about $248 billion every year, again, the resources will be better used for Africa's development. If we're able to address the issues about risk ratings and the perceptions of risks on the continent, either political risk or market risk, and all those risks that make the cost of capital higher for African countries, we'll be saving the continent about $74.5 billion every year. And so on and so forth. If you add up all that Africa loses currently, resources that are mobilized but doesn't stay on the continent because of a number of issues which we as Africans can handle, we will be saving like $1.6 billion daily that should be going into development on the continent. So the summary of it is the whole reason for wanting to look at this is not whether someone is preventing or someone is not preventing. It's about looking at the how. How is it that a continent that is very wealthy with regard to natural capital, natural resources, are not leveraging it effectively as much as it should in order to be able to develop itself? How is it that the human capital of the continent that we're having brain drain, losing our best experts to other countries, subsidizing their own labor markets, where we are needing those skills within the continent? How can we move from brain drain to brain circulation so that Africans who are outside are able to contribute to development within the continent? There are so many tools and policies that we can use in order to make the resources we have already more effective in developing the continent. And that is what we are focusing on in the AEO. Because I've got to travel, I'm actually going to request that I'm permitted to leave so I don't lose my flight. And please welcome you to the days of the meetings and even before the meetings. Engage in dialogue and do what the SG is calling for. Be that journalist that actually finds the facts, not sentiments, and the positive narratives on the continent, not negative narratives. I'm not saying don't say negative things when they happen, but don't hype it. Let us try and focus on evidence-based journalism, and then focus on journalism that spurs leaders and spurs Africans, give us hope to develop better, rather than create scenarios where we feel helpless. If you give birth to a child and say, you are stupid, from the very first day the child is born, I bet you the child will grow up stupid.
Thank you very much. We can allow you to go, but let me add to this question because you asked about Lesotho and then you asked how what the African Development Bank is doing with regard to the tariffs. These tariffs, I'm sure, have become a wake-up call, it appears. And I'm glad you're focusing on it. And the question as to what is the bank doing to help these countries diversify? Let's be clear. The bank doesn't tell countries what they should do. The countries look into how they want to develop and say, we have an idea. And we know that the African Development Bank can support us to carry this through. These tariffs have happened. They affect a number of African countries. The question is, what are the countries going to do to deal with it and be able to now say, AFDB, we're here for you to support us because we want to do A, B, and C, and D. But put it all together. It's all about trade, isn't it? Trading what you produce with others. The relevance of the African Continental Free Trade Area is here. Can you imagine this continent trading among itself? That you produce the best you know how. For example, Lesotho is textile, where they gained access to the American market through AGOA. They were one of the great beneficiaries of AGOA. Okay, tariffs have made it difficult now because Americans will now buy at a higher cost, making it very difficult for the goods to go. Are there new markets within the continent that Lesotho could, those beautiful jeans that they ship to the US that are made in Lesotho? If Africa is able to trade with itself and let the goods circulate among Africa, I think there are new thoughts we need to be able to think. Journalists think about this and write about them. Question those things, ask what Africans are doing, interrogate whether or not the African Continental Free Trade Area is a reality, and it is even more so that you should ask that question now. But the FDB will support every country that has found an avenue. We can work with them to fine-tune how they proceed and how they develop their countries, because it is the catalyst for spurring socioeconomic progress on the continent, and therefore is available to work with member countries and support them, not help them, to achieve their development goals based on what they present to the bank. The bank is not a miracle worker. I hope this helps. Thank you.
Chers confrères en ligne, chers confrères présents dans la salle, je sais qu'il vous reste encore beaucoup de questions qui vous brûlent les lèvres, mais nous allons clôturer cette conférence de presse en vous disant qu'il est encore possible que vous posiez les questions, vous envoyez vos questions par email. Et nous allons les répondre, les différents responsables de la Banque africaine de développement vont les répondre et puis on vous retournera les réponses. Il y a aussi, bien sûr, que les discussions vont se poursuivre lors des assemblées annuelles ici à Abidjan. Donc, vous aurez l'opportunité de rencontrer la haute direction de la banque pour poser toutes les questions que vous souhaiteriez, auxquelles vous n'avez pas eu réponse aujourd'hui. Je voudrais, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, vous laisser la parole pour la clôture.
Thank you very much. We want to thank you, those connected online and those in the room here, for answering the call for this press conference, which launches. This is the pre-annual meeting press conference. And by this conference, it has launched to the entire world that we are getting ready to welcome the world in Côte d'Ivoire for the annual meetings of the bank group. And so we seek your support to publicize the annual meetings. We seek your support to publicize the theme and the significance of the theme in the current realities of global economic policies which you believe are having adverse impact, but it may well be an opportunity as well if the continent addresses it from its own perspective. And we appreciate the communications department and the support that we've received from you. We thank you, interpreters, for the support you've provided to enable us understand one another. And I welcome you to the annual meetings of the bank group as we open the doors in late May. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Okay. Merci beaucoup à tous. Merci d'être venus. Merci d'avoir participé à cette conférence de presse. Nous nous donnons rendez-vous du 26 au 30 mai prochain à Abidjan. Merci et bon après-midi à tous.